Hey guys, this is someone from Petroleum from Scratch, and I will be talking about inflow performance relationship today. In this video, I'll try to explain this concept in a simplistic way. I'll keep the things as simple as possible. So we will start with the basic introduction about this topic. We'll discuss few things and we will talk about dimensionless plot. We will understand its usage, its importance, and lastly, we will conclude this but this topic by discussing about general IPR equation for solution gas drive. We'll go through its derivation and we'll discuss some of the reservoirs cases. So I think most of us know that IPR or inflow performance relationship is a mathematical tool which helps in prediction of well performance. And some people regard this thing as a graphical representation which defines a relationship between flowing bottom hole pressure and your flow rate. So we can think of this thing can be thought of as a machine. This IPR can be thought of as a machine. So if you give an input of PWF, you will obtain an output of Q value. Similarly, if you give an input of Q, then you will obtain corresponding value of PWF. So the first thing which comes into our mind, that how do we obtain this curve? How do we get this graph first of all? So there are few steps which you need to follow. First thing you need to do is shut in the well, and when you shut in the well, your flow rate will be equal to 0. Since your flow rate is equal to 0, your drawdown will be equal to 0, and hence the pressure gauge value at the bottom hole will be equal to the reservoir pressure. So now we have our reservoir pressure value. Now second thing which you need to do is record PWF at a specific flow rate, and this PWF at this corresponding flow rate is called as test data point. And one thing with which you must know is that this test data point has to be recorded when your well is stabilized, and by stabilized I mean that you need to record these value only when pseudo steady state condition is prevailing. So for now we have these three values, and with the help of these three values, by checking out the reservoir conditions, we will develop an IPR equation. So that IPR equation will define a relationship between PWF and Q. Now since we have that equation, by assuming several values of PWF, with the help of that equation you will be able to obtain corresponding value of flow rates. So now you have different large number of values of PWF and Q. So by using these sets of values, you will plot them and you will obtain your IPR curve. Also there is one thing called AOF, which is an abbreviation of absolute open hole factor, which is nothing but a maximum flow rate at a condition, and that condition is characterized when PWF is equal to 0. So this AOF or Qmax has its utility when you derive IPR equation for two-phase flow, and it also gives you an idea of productivity of the well. So higher the value of AOF, higher will be your productivity. This is an general statement. Few exceptions might exist. Now let me give you a basic background of IPR curve. So on the left hand side we have a single phase curve, and I think we have talked about this curve in the previous videos as well. This curve is characterized by a specific parameter called as productivity index, and as we have discussed earlier, this productivity index is a slight modification of Darcy's law. So we can say that this whole straight line, this straight slope line, is characterized by Darcy's law equation of single phase flow. Now this is an ideal condition which does not exist. The graph on the right hand side is the actual scenario. It represents the actual scenario and it is far different from the single phase conditions. So till the bubble point has been achieved, we will obtain single phase flow curve, and when the pressure falls below this bubble point pressure value, there's a development of gas saturation, and because of that you will notice a significant deviation from the straight line curve. So the flow rate which you will obtain in the actual scenario will be far lesser than what you will be obtaining in single phase flow curve. So if I explain you this deviation with the help of this diagram, I have taken two porous medium which represents two different reservoir. The reservoir on the left hand side is a fictional reservoir, and there's a property of this fictional reservoir that even if the pressure falls below the bubble point pressure, there is no development of second phase. And similarly, we have another reservoir of same dimensions, of safe characteristics. The only thing here is that ideal condition prevails in this reservoir, and therefore when the pressure falls below the bubble point, there is a development of gas saturation. So if we apply a pressure differential of delta P across both the reservoirs, you will obtain a flow rate of Q in this case, which will be much higher than the flow rate which you will be obtaining in this actual scenario. So why is this happening? And that's because when the pressure falls below in this reservoir, there's a development of gas saturation. So this green dots represents gas saturation, and with the advent of gas saturation, they will occupy some amount of pore volumes, and therefore when the pressure differential is applied, fluid will flow, and the fluid in this case will not flow as easily as it is flowing in this case, as it is not encountering any sort of restriction. It is easily passing through this porous medium, whereas in this case there are a lot of restrictions and obstructions. So this development of gas saturation will reduce the flow rate of oil. So that's why there's a deviation which we obtain. Now so far we have knowledge till this point. We know how to calculate this equation, we know how to develop this graph, but it is practically impossible to manually generate a equation which defines this graph, this curved graph. So at this point Mr. Vogel comes into the picture. Now what he did, he collected different datas of different PWF versus Q data from different reservoirs of varying conditions, and conditions such as GOR, viscosity of fluid, these things were varying, and he also took some conditions that in a single reservoir he took PWF versus Q data at different stages. Now instead of making a plot of PWF versus Q, he made a plot of dimensionless pressure versus dimensionless Q. So in this case, the graph on the left hand side, you can see that the reservoir is same, but different graphs, these different lines represent cumulative production or recovery factor. Now on increasing the cumulative production, the energy of reservoir will decline, the pressure of reservoir will decline, and therefore there will be a large variation in the reservoir property as the pressure is declining. But since even there's a large variation, all these curves tend to have a similar nature, they tend to follow a similar trend. So what he did, he generated a single reference curve, and this curve is defined by this equation. So this equation is popularly known as Vogels equation, Vogels IPR equation, and this is the equation which we use generally to define this curved path. Although this equation is only 100% valid for only this specific curve, but the beauty of using dimensionless plot is, even though the conditions are having a large variation, the curve, the nature and the trend line is almost similar. So in the right hand side in this graph, we can see that there are two different curves. So A and B represent two different reservoirs. The reservoir B has a crude oil have a crude oil of lower viscosity, and reservoir A has a crude oil of higher viscosity. And since the productivity of the reservoir with lower viscosity will be higher, therefore this curve, the curve which represents reservoir B is slightly lifted. And similar case you can see here that with the increase of recovery factor, energy of reservoir will decrease, hence the graph is shrinking like this. So that is there about IPR equation, two-phase IPR equation, and this was the Vogel's idea. So this equation is an empirical, this is a reference curve, and this equation is completely 100% error free only for this curve. So we'll continue with the general form of two-phase flow equation, and we'll talk about its derivation in the next video.